I don't know if I'm ready, but go for it.
Yeah.
Whenever you're ready.
It was early on a Thursday morning. My grandfather drove up in his Toyota Sienna and backed it into the garage for me to start working on some struts and some shocks I told him I'd replace a week before. It was, I expected it to be a simple job. I've never done struts before, but I figured you just kind of drop a few bolts, pull the wheel off, and just slap the new ones back on. And it was only maybe supposed to take maybe 4 hours at the most. Now, I know my grandfather doesn't know too much about kind of automotive repair, so I just anticipated that I'd be doing most of the work, and then he'd kind of be standing behind me, being able to hand me different tools as I needed them, sitting on the ground. Maybe about 10-15 minutes into the job, I got one wheel off, and I'm sitting there removing one of the struts. My dad comes into the garage with a pot of coffee. It was a well-needed pot of coffee, but he decided that he wanted to help as well. So I said, all right, and then he kind of helped direct my grandfather around and kind of keep everything organized as I was hanging out down by the car. We pulled the strut and the coil spring off of the front end and began compressing it in order to remove the strut from the center. It was then when I realized that one of the boots that kind of shields the piston on the strut for the suspension of the car was damaged. It's just a little rubber or plastic shield that just keeps rocks and debris just from scratching up the surface and just messing up that seal. So I decided it was worthwhile to maybe take a visit and a trip to O'Reilly's and get a couple replacements. My dad just happened to take a phone call from my sister at that point, so my grandfather and I left him behind. We took my dad's truck, went over to the O'Reilly's, and then my dad decided to start working on the other side of the car. He sent me a text, which I saw when I got to the parking lot of O'Reilly's and didn't think much about it. He was gonna start working on the opposite side. I figured he could figure it out. And boy, was I wrong. We got the replacement boots, got back in the car, and as I started driving, I hear my phone vibrate in the cup holder below me. Now, being the law-abiding citizen that I am, I didn't check my cell phone or open up my text messages as I was driving. I figured it was something that could wait maybe 5 minutes until I was back at home. Then it started ringing. I still didn't pick it up. I had to convince my grandfather, who was sitting in the passenger seat, that I was a good kid. Then my grandfather's phone started ringing, and for some reason he wasn't able to pick it up. He just couldn't figure that out, I guess. So I'm pulling up to my house. My grandfather does answer his phone, and I hear that my dad hurt himself. I expected that when you compress the spring, you have a lot of force that you're just kind of containing in a small area. I expected that to have exploded and hit him somehow, which would be tremendously bad. And I show up to the driveway and I see my father sitting on a bucket with his hand wrapped in a dirty rag above his head. And I ran up to him and I'm like, hey, what happened? Are you all right? And he said, I think I cut my finger off removing the strut from the wheel. So I unwrapped very slowly the rag on his finger, and surprisingly there wasn't much blood, but there was the tip of his finger barely hanging on by just a meat of skin that was remaining. What ended up happening was my father recently had knee surgery maybe a couple weeks before that, just to remove some, bad stuff to relieve some pain from when he was older. So when he was working on the wheel, instead of squatting down about eye level like I was, he was arched over, looking down from the top. So the way it worked is the strut comes down and you have two big bolts that connect it to the wheel well. And when you jack up the car, the wheel falls down, putting the spring and shock under tension. He was removing the last of the two bolts with his finger inside of the hole, making sure the bolt was coming out the other side. When it slipped out and the shock and strut snap up into the car as the wheel drops down below with his finger still inside. So that's how he sliced it real quick. I ran inside to grab my wallet because it was something I missed when I went to the auto parts store because I knew I was going to be driving him to the hospital. And By the time I come back, my grandfather loaded him into the back of the pickup truck, and he was on the phone with his insurance, trying to figure out an urgent care that was nearby, therefore he wouldn't have to pay the expensive copay of the emergency room. I just started driving to give my father some fresh air when I realized that on the speakerphone he was selected for a random survey by the insurance, which coincidentally took place before a representative picked up the phone. After the survey, they sent us to an urgent care, who then took $35 as my dad and I went back in the other room, as I could overhear my grandfather having a lively discussion with another old gentleman in the waiting room, talking about how Obama upset the healthcare system of America. They wrapped my dad's finger in a bandage and then just sent us to ER. So it was just a huge waste of time. It took maybe about 4 hours just sitting in the ER waiting to get called back. I kept telling my dad maybe he should start like making a big scene, start like complaining that his fingers hurt and starting moaning, just kind of like fidgeting in his chair. But he just sat there all calm, and it took a long time to get called back. They ended calling us back, and then it took another couple hours just to rinse out the wound, shove some needles in it, stitch it up, and then end up giving him a tetanus shot. After that point, it was maybe 4 p.m. And I told my grandfather I'd have the car done for him by noon, because he had choir practice later that day, and then needed to drive home because his wife was home alone, babysitting the neighbor next door. That didn't happen. So when I got home, I tried to finish the front end of the car as quickly as possible to get him on his way, which took maybe a couple more hours, and then it required him to come back in the morning for me to finish the rear end of the car. And that is how easily that a couple-hour job in auto mechanics can quickly turn to a multiple-day event.